They thought humiliating her would be easy, but the moment Rachel Morgan stepped through those glass doors, something invisible shifted. The kind of tension you only notice when it's already too late. The dojo was bright, polished wood floors reflecting the afternoon sun, rows of black belts stretching and chatting with quiet confidence, the kind built from years of discipline and reputation. And right in the middle of it all, Rachel looked like she didn't belong. Her sneakers were worn, her hoodie plain, her hair pulled back, without effort, no logos, no signs of status, nothing that earned respect in a place like this. A few heads turned, then a few smirks followed. Jason Blake, the head instructor, noticed her immediately. He had trained champions, built reputations, broken egos for a living, and in his world people were sorted in seconds, strong or weak, worth his time or not. And Rachel had already been placed in the latter category. You looking for the beginner class, he called out loud enough for the room to hear. A ripple of laughter followed, soft at first, then growing as others joined in. Rachel stopped a few feet onto the mat, her eyes scanning the room calmly, not defensive, not intimidated, just observant, like someone reading a situation instead of reacting to it. "I'm here to train," she said, her voice quiet, steady, almost too calm for someone standing in the center of that attention. Jason raised an eyebrow, amused. "You picked the wrong place for that, sweetheart. This isn't cardio kickboxing. This is where people actually know what they're doing." More laughter. A few black belts exchanged glances, already entertained by what they assumed would be a short-lived attempt. Rachel didn't respond. She simply set her bag down near the wall and stepped forward another inch. The sound of her shoes against the wood floor barely noticeable, yet somehow it carried. One of the younger students hesitated, watching her more closely than the others. There was something off. Not weak, not unsure, just controlled, like every movement had already been decided before it happened. Jason crossed his arms, tilting his head, studying her now with mild curiosity rather than dismissal. "You ever trained before?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he already believed he knew the answer. Rachel met his gaze for the first time, not challenging, not submissive, just steady enough. She replied, and that single word lingered longer than expected. The room didn't go silent, but the laughter softened, replaced by something harder to name. Jason let out a short breath, shaking his head like he'd just confirmed a joke. "All right, then," he said, clapping his hands. "Once let's give everyone a little demonstration." He gestured toward the center of the mat, calling over one of his top students, a tall black belt known for his speed and precision, the kind of fighter who rarely had to prove himself anymore because his reputation did it for him. The student stepped forward confidently, rolling his shoulders loose, relaxed, already assuming the outcome. Rachel stood across from him, hands at her sides, posture neutral, not even raising a guard, which only brought a few quiet chuckles back into the room. Jason smirked, glancing at the others. 10 seconds, he said casually, like he was announcing the weather. "That's all this will take." Rachel exhaled slowly, her eyes no longer scanning, no longer observing. Now they were fixed, focused, and for the first time since she walked in, someone near the back felt it, a shift so subtle it almost didn't exist, like the room itself had just realized it made a mistake. The tall black belt stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. His movements were loose, controlled, practiced over years of repetition, the kind of presence that usually made opponents hesitate before anything even began. He gave Rachel a quick nod, not out of respect, but out of routine, like checking a box before finishing a task. The room leaned in slightly, some folding their arms, others smirking, already predicting the outcome. Jason Blake took a step back, watching with quiet satisfaction. This was familiar territory for him. Control the room, control the narrative, and let the result reinforce the hierarchy he had built. Rachel remained exactly where she was, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, as if the noise around her existed somewhere far away. The black belt shifted his weight, testing distance, measuring her reaction. But she did not react, not even a flinch, and that was the first crack in the rhythm, something subtle, but enough for one or two people to notice. He moved first, closing the space with speed, expecting the usual hesitation, expecting her to step back or freeze, but instead Rachel adjusted barely, an inch, a movement so small it almost went unseen, yet it redirected everything. His momentum carried him slightly off balance, not enough to fall, but enough to pause, just enough for confusion to flicker across his face. A brief interruption in certainty. The room did not laugh this time. It waited. The black belt reset, quickly brushing it off, stepping back into position. A few people shifted uncomfortably, their earlier amusement softening into curiosity. Jason narrowed his eyes, now paying closer attention. Rachel still had not raised her hands, not in the way they expected, not in the way beginners were taught. she stood relaxed, centered like she was, not reacting to him, but to something deeper, something internal, something practiced far beyond this room. He tried again, faster this time, more precise, aiming to reassert control, but once again Rachel moved just enough, a step angled differently, a turn of her shoulder that changed the entire exchange. The result was not dramatic, there was no spectacle, just efficiency, just control, and in that quiet moment the black belt found himself stopping again, not because he was forced to, but because something no longer made sense. The silence in the room grew heavier, not complete, but undeniable. Whispers did not return. Instead, there was a shift in breathing, in posture, in attention. People who had been leaning casually were now standing straighter, watching closer, trying to understand what they were seeing. Jason took another step forward, now fully engaged, his earlier confidence replaced by calculation. He had seen thousands of students move, thousands of sparring sessions unfold, but this felt different, not stronger, not faster, just different. Rachel finally lifted her gaze directly to her opponent, her expression calm, almost patient, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. The black belt hesitated for half a second longer than before, and that half second was enough for the room to feel it. The shift was no longer subtle, it was present, it was spreading, and somewhere near the back a voice, barely above a whisper, spoke a name, Rachel Morgan, and the effect was immediate, a ripple of recognition passing through one person, then another, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to change everything. Jason heard it too, his posture stiffening slightly as he looked at her again, not as a beginner, not as an interruption, but as a question he had not expected to ask. And for the first time since she walked in, he was no longer in control of what happened next. Jason Blake did not speak right away, and that alone was enough to change the energy in the room, because a man like him always had something to say, always had control over the narrative. But now he was watching, measuring, recalculating. Rachel Morgan stood across from his top student, as if nothing had shifted, yet everything had. The black belt exhaled slowly, trying to regain the rhythm he had lost. His confidence was still there, but it had changed shape, no longer careless now. It was cautious, and that caution spread like a quiet signal to everyone watching. He adjusted his stance again, more deliberate. This time, no unnecessary movement, no assumptions. Rachel remained still, not frozen, not passive, but grounded, like someone who had already solved a problem no one else realized existed. He stepped in again, but this time slower, testing her reaction instead of forcing it. And again she responded with minimal movement, a slight shift of her foot, a turn of her body that redirected the entire exchange without effort, without strain. There was no impact, no dramatic finish, just a clean interruption of his intention. And that was what unsettled him most. It was not that she was stronger or faster, it was that she was always one step ahead, as if she had already seen what he was about to do before he even decided to do it. A murmur almost formed in the room, but it never became sound. The silence held tighter, now heavier, more focused. One of the younger students who had been watching closely leaned toward another and whispered again, Rachel Morgan. This time the name did not drift, it landed. A few heads turned, recognition flickering across faces that had not taken her seriously just moments ago. Jason heard it clearly now, and his jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization. He stepped closer to the edge of the mat, his voice finally breaking the silence. Enough, that is enough, he said, but there was no authority in it this time, only restraint. The black belt stepped back, immediately relieved to pause the exchange, but also unwilling to admit it. Rachel lowered her gaze slightly, her posture returning to neutral, as if nothing significant had happened, as if she had simply completed a routine movement. Jason studied her longer, now his mind moving through memories, names, records, moments that did not line up, until suddenly they did. Rachel Morgan, he repeated under his breath, the name, connecting to something buried in reputation and stories passed through circles he respected, but rarely questioned. He had heard it before, not loudly, not publicly, but enough to remember, enough to know it was not a name that appeared without reason. The room remained quiet, waiting for him to respond, waiting for him to restore the order that had just been disrupted. But Jason did not move immediately, because for the first time he understood that the situation was no longer his to control. Rachel lifted her bag from the floor, slowly, not in retreat, but in completion, as if she had already decided what this place was worth. Her eyes moved across the room one last time, not judging, not seeking approval, just acknowledging what had been revealed. Without a single word, Jason finally stepped forward, his voice lower, now measured. Rachel, he said, and this time there was no mockery, no dismissal, only a question hidden beneath the surface, something unspoken, something that carried weight. Are you just here to train? Or did you come here to remind us of something? Rachel paused at the edge of the mat, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag. She did not turn fully back, only enough for her voice to carry clearly through the silence. I did not come to remind anyone, she said calmly. I came to see who still needed to learn. And in that moment, no one in the room felt like laughing anymore. No one moved after she spoke, and that silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt heavy, like something had settled into the room that could not be ignored. Jason Blake stood there watching her more carefully than he had watched anyone in years. His mind no longer focused on control, but on understanding, the kind of understanding that only comes when pride begins to loosen its grip. The students around him shifted subtly, some straightening their posture, others lowering their gaze, as if suddenly aware of how quickly they had judged her only minutes ago. The tall black belt who had stepped in first exhaled, slowly stepping back another inch, not out of fear, but out of recognition that what he had just experienced was not a fluke, not a lucky moment, but something structured, something intentional, something far beyond the surface. Rachel Morgan adjusted the strap on her bag, but did not leave, yet there was no rush in her movements, no need to escape the attention, because she had never been trying to avoid it in the first place. She had simply allowed it to reveal what it needed to reveal. Jason finally took another step forward, his voice quieter, now no longer projecting across the room, but directed at her alone. You have trained before, he said again, but this time it was not a question, it was an acknowledgement. Rachel gave a small nod, not as confirmation, but as acceptance of something already obvious. The room listened closely now, not because they were entertained, but because they understood they were witnessing something they had misread from the beginning. Jason glanced briefly at his students, then back at Rachel, his expression no longer sharp, but measured, almost reflective. There are not many places that teach movement like that, he said, carefully choosing his words, as if each one carried weight. You do not get that from casual training. Rachel remained still, her eyes steady on him, not challenging, not defensive, just present. I did not come here to compare methods, she replied calmly. I came to see if this place still teaches awareness, or if it only teaches confidence. A few students lowered their eyes at that statement, not because it was harsh, but because it was accurate, and accuracy has a way of cutting deeper than any insult. Jason let out a slow breath, the kind that carries years of routine and habit behind it. He turned slightly, addressing the room, but not with authority, this time with something closer to honesty. We train hard here, he said. We build discipline, we build strength, but strength without awareness becomes noise, and noise does not last. The words settled differently than his usual commands, because they were not meant to instruct, they were meant to admit something. The room absorbed it quietly. Rachel watched him for a moment longer, then finally shifted her weight, turning slightly toward the exit, not in dismissal, but in completion. Her presence had already done what it needed to do. Jason spoke again, before she could take a step. If you walk out now, he said, his tone steady, but no longer guarded, then you leave them with confusion. Rachel paused, not turning fully back, just enough to listen. Confusion can be useful, she replied. It forces people to look again. Jason considered that for a second, then nodded slowly, as if accepting a lesson he had not expected to receive. One of the younger students stepped forward hesitantly, his voice uncertain, but genuine. Are you coming back? Rachel glanced over her shoulder, just briefly, her expression unchanged, but her eyes softer than before. That depends, she said quietly, on whether this place chooses to learn or chooses to stay comfortable. And with that, she took her first step toward the door, and for the first time since the afternoon began, no one tried to stop her, no one laughed, no one spoke, because sometimes the loudest lesson is the one that leaves the room before anyone is ready for it. The door had almost closed behind Rachel Morgan when Jason Blake's voice cut through the quiet again, not loud, not commanding, but deliberate. Rachel paused, her hand still on the handle, the late afternoon light spilling across the floor behind her, casting long shadows that stretched back into the room. Jason stepped forward slowly, not to assert control, but to bridge a distance that had suddenly become more than physical. You are right, he said, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier certainty. We have been teaching confidence and calling it awareness. A few students shifted at that admission, some looking at the floor, others watching Rachel, as if waiting for something more than words to happen. The tall black belt who had stepped forward earlier took a breath, then spoke for the first time since the silence settled. I did not see it, he admitted, not looking at Rachel, but at the space between them. I thought I understood timing, distance, control, but I was only reacting to what I expected, not what was actually there. Rachel turned slightly, now facing them again, not fully returning but no longer leaving either. Her presence balance between exit and engagement. Awareness is not about expecting, she said calmly. It is about noticing what is already happening. Most people do not fail because they are weak. They fail because they decide too early what something is. Jason nodded, slowly absorbing that nod as instruction, but as correction, something he had not allowed himself to receive in a long time. The younger student who had spoken earlier stepped closer, this time his voice more certain. How do you train that? He asked, not as a challenge, but as a question someone truly wanted answered. Rachel looked at him for a moment, then at the rest of the room, her gaze moving across faces that were no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but attentive in a way that could not be fake. You stop trying to win, she said simply, and you start trying to understand. The room held that sentence differently than anything before, because it did not offer a technique, it offered a shift, and shifts are harder to accept than instructions. Jason exhaled again, longer this time, then turned to his students. We start over, he said, not as an order, but as a decision. No ranks, no assumptions, no shortcuts. We train awareness from the ground up. A ripple moved through the group, not resistance, not excitement, but something quieter, something closer to commitment. Rachel watched him for a second longer, then finally stepped back fully into the doorway, her silhouette framed by the fading light. You asked if I came to remind you of something, she said softly. Now I did not, but maybe you reminded yourselves. Jason gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement of a moment that had changed more than he would say out loud. The tall black belt straightened his posture, this time not out of pride, but out of intention. The younger student looked down at his hands, then back up, as if seeing them differently. Rachel opened the door fully, this time the cool air from outside slipping into the room, and for a brief second the space felt larger, less confined, as if something had been released without being forced. She stepped out without looking back, the door closing quietly behind her. No dramatic exit, no final gesture, just absence, and yet that absence filled the room more completely than her presence had before. Jason stood still for a moment longer, then turned back to the mat, his voice calm but clear again. Line up, he said, and this time no one moved with arrogance, no one smirked, no one assumed, because the lesson had already begun before they realized it. And as the first steps fell into place, one thought lingered quietly in every mind, not about who she was, but about what they had missed and whether they would recognize it next time. The room did not return to what it was before, and that was the first thing everyone noticed, not immediately, but gradually, like a background noise that had been removed and replaced with something quieter, something sharper. Jason Blake stood at the front of the mat watching his students line up again, but this time the lines were different, not in formation, but in energy. Shoulders were no longer squared out of pride. They were aligned with intention. Eyes were no longer scanning for approval. They were focused inward, measuring something harder to define. Begin again, Jason said, and his voice carried a weight it had not carried earlier, not authority, but responsibility. The first pair stepped forward, including the tall black belt from before. His movements were slower, now not weaker, just deliberate. He did not rush, he did not assume. He watched his partner closely, not waiting for an opening, but noticing what was already there. A small shift of balance, a change in breathing, something subtle, something real. And when he moved, it was not to overpower, but to respond. And for the first time that day, his movement looked different, not because it was more complex, but because it was honest. The younger student who had asked the question earlier stood at the edge, observing closely, his brow slightly furrowed, not in confusion, but in concentration. He mimicked the stance, quietly adjusting his footing, trying to feel what Rachel had described, not strength, not speed, but awareness. Jason walked between them slowly, his hands behind his back, not correcting, not interrupting, just watching, and that alone changed the atmosphere, because they were no longer performing for him, they were training for something they had not understood before. Minutes passed without a single laugh, without a single careless comment. The room had settled into a rhythm that did not need noise to exist, and in that rhythm small changes began to appear. Movements became cleaner, reactions became quieter, pauses became intentional. Even mistakes looked different now, not rushed, not hidden, but examined, as if each one carried information worth understanding. The tall black belt stepped back after a sequence, nodding once to his partner, not in victory, but in acknowledgement, and that nod carried more respect than anything he had shown earlier. Jason stopped near the center of the mat, his gaze sweeping across the group. This is where it begins, he said quietly, not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. Not the techniques, not the belts, not the titles, but the moment you realize you have been seeing only what you wanted to see. A few students lowered their gaze Again, not out of shame, but out of recognition because once you see that you cannot unsee it, and that realization has a way of staying long after the moment passes outside, the sun had dipped lower, casting a softer light through the windows, stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines. The dojo felt different, not emptier, but more open, like something had been cleared without being removed. Jason paused for a second longer, then spoke again. Tomorrow we start earlier, he said. No warm-up routine, no drills. Just observation. We will learn to notice before we learn to act. There was no complaint, no hesitation, just a quiet acceptance that something had changed, and that change required more than words. The younger student nodded slightly to himself, as if making a decision. The tall black belt exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, not to loosen tension, but to release something he had been holding on to for years. Jason turned toward the door briefly, his eyes resting there for a second longer than necessary, as if expecting something or someone. But the doorway remained still, the hallway beyond empty and silent. He did not call out, he did not move toward it, because he understood now that some lessons do not return, they leave, and what they leave behind is what matters. He turned back to his students and raised his hand. Begin again, he said, and this time the words did not start a session, they continued something that had already begun long before they realized it. The next morning arrived earlier than usual, not just on the clock, but in the way the room felt. When the first student pushed open the door, the lights were already on the air, still carrying the quiet from the night before, but something had changed. Even before anyone spoke, the younger student stepped in first, glancing around, as if expecting to see her again, but the space remained still, empty, except for the faint echo of what had happened the day before. He placed his bag down more carefully than usual, not out of habit, but out of awareness. A few minutes later, others began to arrive one by one. No loud greetings, no casual jokes, just quiet nods and focused movements, as if each person had made a decision before walking in. Jason Blake stood near the far end of the mat, already there, already watching, not as a judge, but as someone waiting to see if something real would continue or fade. He checked the clock briefly, then looked up. Begin, he said simply, and no one asked what that meant, because they already understood. There were no drills, no commands, no demonstration, just observation. Pairs formed naturally, without instruction. The tall black belt stepped forward again, this time choosing a different partner, not the strongest, not the fastest, just someone present and attentive. They faced each other in silence, not rushing, not performing, just standing and noticing. Small details began to emerge, the way weight shifted from one foot to the other, the timing of a breath, the slight tightening of a shoulder before movement. The younger student mirrored the stance across the room, his eyes focused not on winning, not on impressing, but on seeing, and for the first time, he realized how much he had been missing before, how much noise had filled the space where awareness should have been. Minutes passed with minimal movement, and yet the room felt more active than ever. Every small adjustment carried meaning, every pause held intention. Jason walked slowly between them again, not correcting, not guiding, just observing, and as he did, he noticed something that had not been there before. Hesitation, not from fear, but from consideration. Each student was thinking before moving, but not overthinking, not freezing, just allowing the moment to reveal itself before acting, and that shift changed everything. The tall black belt moved first, but differently. Now no rush, no assumption, just a response to what he saw. And when his partner adjusted, he adjusted. Again, not forcing, not controlling, just staying with the moment. The exchange ended quietly, not with a clear winner, but with a shared understanding, and they both stepped back, nodding once to each other. That nod meant more now than any victory from the day before. Jason stopped at the center of the mat, watching them closely. This is what most people never reach, he said, his voice low but steady, not because they cannot, but because they refused to slow down long enough to see. A few students glanced at him, then back at their partners, as if confirming that what they were experiencing was real. The younger student took a deeper breath, this time his shoulders relaxing as he stopped trying to anticipate and instead began to notice. His partner moved, and he did not react immediately. He waited just long enough to understand, and then he moved, not faster, not stronger, just more accurate. And for the first time, his movement felt natural, not forced across the room. Someone else made the same adjustment, and then another, until the entire space shifted into a rhythm that did not rely on instruction. It flowed quietly, consistently, as if the lesson was now teaching itself. Jason turned his head slightly toward the door again, not expecting, but aware, and in that brief moment, he understood something clearly. She had not come to train, she had come to reveal, and what she revealed could not be undone. He looked back at his students and saw it in them, not fully formed, not complete, but present, the beginning of something real. And as the session continued, no one spoke about her name, no one asked questions no one needed to, because the answer was already there in every movement, in every pause, in every moment they chose to see, instead of assume, and somewhere in that quiet progression, one thought settled into the room stronger than before, not about who she was, but about whether they would be ready if she ever decided to walk back through that door again. By the third day, the room no longer felt like the same place it had been before, and no one needed to say it out loud to know it was true. The changes were no longer subtle. They were visible in posture and pacing, in the way students entered without noise and took their positions without waiting to be told. Jason Blake stood at the center again, but this time he did not begin the session immediately. He watched longer, letting the silence settle deeper, letting each person arrive fully before anything started. The tall black belt adjusted his stance across from a new partner, his movements now stripped of excess. There was no display, no unnecessary motion, just clarity. The younger student stood nearby, already focused before the session even began, his breathing steady, his eyes attentive, not searching for approval but for understanding. Jason finally spoke, but his voice carried differently, now not as instruction, but as reflection. Most people think progress is loud. He said they think it looks like speed or power or recognition, but real progress is quiet. It is the moment you stop needing to prove something and start seeing what is actually there. The students listened without breaking their focus, because his words no longer interrupted the training. They aligned with it. Pairs began to move again, slowly, intentionally, and something new appeared, not just awareness, but connection. Each exchange became less about individual action and more about shared timing, shared space, shared understanding. Movements flowed not because they were rehearsed, but because they were recognized. The tall black belt paused mid-motion for a brief second, noticing something subtle in his partner's balance, then adjusted without forcing anything, and the result was clean, effortless, almost invisible. The younger student mirrored that shift across the room, his hesitation gone, replaced by patience, and in that patience he found precision, something he had never reached before, because he had always rushed past it. Jason walked through them again, his eyes sharper now, not correcting, but confirming that what he had hoped to see was real. This is where most people turn back, he said quietly, not because it is difficult, but because it is honest. And honesty requires letting go of everything you thought made you strong. A few students absorbed that more deeply than others, but all of them felt it in different ways. The room had reached a point where noise could no longer exist, because it had nothing to attach to outside. The afternoon light shifted again, softer now, stretching across the floor in long, steady lines. The air felt still but alive, like something was holding its breath, not in tension, but in anticipation. Jason stopped near the entrance, his gaze drifting briefly toward the door again, not expecting, but aware. And this time something was different, not in sound, not in movement, but in presence. The door did not open, no footsteps followed, but the feeling of being observed returned, subtle and undeniable. The younger student noticed it, first his eyes flicking toward the entrance, then back to his partner, as if unsure whether to trust what he felt. The tall black belt slowed his movement slightly, not stopping, just noticing the same shift. Jason remained still for a second longer, then spoke again, without turning. If you feel it, then you are starting to understand. The words settled immediately, because they were not directed at one person, but at everyone. The room did not react with surprise, it responded with focus. Movements became even more refined, even more precise, as if each student was now aware of something beyond what they could see, and in that awareness, they moved differently, not to impress, not to prove, but to align with something real. Jason finally turned his head slightly toward the door, his expression unreadable but steady, and though no one stood there, no one entered. The presence remained, not as a person, but as a standard, something that had been set and could not be lowered. And in that moment, every student understood the same thing at once. She might not walk back through that door, but what she left behind would always be there, watching, not judging, not guiding, just waiting to see who would rise to meet it. Weeks passed, and the dojo no longer needed reminders of what had happened, because the change had settled into its foundation, not as a story to repeat, but as a standard to live by. Jason Blake stood at the edge of the mat one quiet morning, watching his students move with a level of awareness that had once seemed out of reach. Their steps were measured, their timing intentional, their focus no longer scattered across the room, but anchored within each moment. The tall black belt who once relied on speed now moved with restraint choosing precision over display, and in that restraint he had become more effective than ever before. The younger student, who once hesitated, now carried a quiet confidence not built on proving himself, but on understanding what was happening in front of him, and that understanding had transformed everything. Jason walked slowly between them, not as an instructor correcting mistakes, but as someone observing growth that no longer needed direction. The room was silent, not empty, but full of purpose, each movement connected to the next, each pause meaningful, each exchange balanced. And in that balance, there was something new, something steady, something real. The door remained closed, as it had been for days, yet no one forgot it, no one ignored the space it represented, because it had become more than an entrance, it had become a reminder of the moment. Everything changed. Jason stopped at the center again, his eyes moving across the room, taking in what had been built from a single disruption. Weeks earlier, most people think respect is given, he said quietly, but respect is not something you receive, it is something you grow into when you stop assuming you already deserve it. The students did not stop moving, but his words settled into them, shaping their focus, sharpening their awareness. The tall black belt paused briefly, then continued with a subtle adjustment, one that reflected not correction, but evolution. The younger student mirrored the same idea across the room, not copying, but understanding. Jason glanced toward the door once more, and this time there was no expectation, no anticipation, only acknowledgement, because he understood now that some people do not return not because they cannot, but because they have already done what they came to do. Outside, the light shifted again, casting long, steady lines across the floor, and in that quiet moment something became clear to everyone at once, not through words, not through instruction, but through experience. Strength had never been about being seen, it had never been about proving anything to anyone, it had always been about seeing clearly and responding honestly, and that clarity had been given to them by someone who did not need to stay to be remembered. Jason took a slow breath, then spoke one final time, not as a command, but as a truth. Carry this with you, he said, not just here, not just on this mat, but everywhere, because the moment you forget it is the moment you start losing again. No one answered, no one needed to. The room continued moving, but now every movement carried meaning, every step carried awareness, every pause carried understanding, and as the session went on, the silence remained not as emptiness, but as proof that something deeper had taken root. And that day the dojo did not just train, it remembered what it felt like to truly see, and in that remembering it became something it had never been before, something quieter, stronger, and impossible to underestimate.